I'm curious. I am curious. Curious.
By nature.
Welcome to Curious by Nature. I'm Jessica Johnson from Newswise. The era between the Great Depression and World War II was filled with intense debate among policymakers and intellectuals about how America should engage with the world. Many argued that the U.S. had a responsibility to ensure economic and political order, leading to a new vision of globalism that reshaped international relations. Today, we see a stark contrast as political circles increasingly shift back toward isolationism, raising critical questions about the future of global power dynamics. Our guest today has devoted his research to examining these historical cycles of engagement and retreat. His book, Look at the World, explores how globalism took root in the 20th century and how these debates continue to shape American foreign policy today. Dr. Ekbladh, thank you for joining us. Please introduce yourself.
I'm David Ekbladh. I'm professor of history at Tufts University. I'm curious about just about everything. I'm curious about how the past brought us to the present.
Tell me about your work.
So my work, I'm what's called a historian of the U.S. and the world, which a generation or two ago might have been called U.S. foreign relations or diplomatic history, but it's basically the history of how the U.S. influences the world and how the world influences the U.S. And so that gives you one of the joys of working in that field is that gives you just about everything under the sun almost to work on. And my own particular interests have been around the 20th century and some big picture elements. I did a book on my first book actually was on the place of the idea of development in U.S. foreign policy, and that left a lot of unanswered questions and kind of left me open to some of the work I'm working on now. I'm very interested in some of the big picture elements of what does the modern world mean to the United States? How does the U.S. try and shape that? And that sounds vague, but the idea is what are the possibilities that some of the things that industrial society, to use terms people are using in the 20th century, but today might say technology, some of the possibilities that a high-tech society give you. How do people argue about that? How does that influence what they attempt? How does that influence ideology, society, culture? And a lot of things, more than I think people assume, arguments in politics, arguments in culture are framed around that issue. And even today, particularly, you can see that in politics today, for example.
Are you researching something specific at the moment?
There are a couple of things I'm working on. One is a sort of a short project about how the argument over the U.S. place in the world kind of goes back and forth. It's not as simple as isolation versus internationalism or engagement versus non-engagement, Wilsonianism versus Hamiltonianism, as one scholar put it. It's more about how some arguments and some ideas keep coming up in different historical contexts. So I'm working on that. The other thing, though, that is beginning to supplant that is a project on a kidnapping in 1975 in Africa of a set of primatologists that that's an international event and highlights elements of the post-colonial world and the Cold War and draws in people like Henry Kissinger and Julius Nyerere and a whole set of interesting figures many people probably haven't heard of but are very interesting in their own right. But it not only has this international impact at the time, it actually changes one of the ways we understand human origins. So it's this really interesting kind of micro history where you can use, one of the things I love about history is you can use this one event as kind of a lens to see some larger things. And I'm working on that. And I'm also, very much, in the middle of kind of processing everything I'm working on with Look at the World and um, kind of completing that thought.
Can you tell me more about your recent book?
Look at the World explores how a new formula for American global engagement emerged out of the crisis of the Depression. And this was a very contested and argued thing. But I look at how a set of Americans, inside and outside the government, and mostly outside the government, um, looked at the world differently because of the crisis they were going through, and saw that their country, because of the position it was in the world, it had become a very powerful, important player in a lot of ways, needed to become the guarantor of global stability. And that's what globalism means in this context. And it was a very wide-ranging debate and had a deep impact. And one of the things, too, one of the reasons these ideas began to stick was because they had broad adherents. They were not just a particular cabal of people. Many of these internationally minded people who became increasingly globally minded courted the public. These ideas, which many people see, and even at the time saw them coming from the political left, um, began to migrate into the political right. And that's an important part of the story, too, is that these figures and individuals arguing for greater American global engagement um, begin to shift political assumptions and political parties as much as public debate and scholarly understanding.
What's the difference between globalization and multinationalism?
You can have a kind of globalism where you say that the U.S. has to be the guarantor of global stability, right? And however the U.S. does that through economic, military power, combination of both, you can do that in a nationalistic, the U.S. as the single power to do that. You could try that. One of the things in this period is that many of the people saying the U.S. should take on a more intense global role and really be the decisive power in world affairs do see a more multilateral way of doing this, right? They prefer it to be done multilaterally, and multilaterally, many sides, right? And that you would have partners with this. You would work through international institutions. You would be collaborative, and that's often the distinction sometimes between a certain type of a more nationalistic policy and a more international policy. One of the things, too, and this is the thing that historians, we love our details and we love our texture. One of the distinctions is many of these people who are advocating for this in the Depression years have long been internationalists in the sense that, we should work more collaboratively, we should work more multilaterally. Their globalism in this period is that they begin to move away from the U.S. as part of the group. Then the U.S. should be the primary part of the group, the prima inter pares, or even more distinctly, the U.S. needs to lead because the system's broken, right? Something profoundly has broken, and the U.S. needs to repair it and then take care of it.
Also, is there an aspect of power control, not just about repair?
Yeah, very definitely. And it's a fine line. It's a fine line of how you want to look at even some of the ways this is discussed. That for a lot of these figures, the attitude is, look, this is somewhat defensive. The world has gone off kilter because of the Depression. We've seen the rise of these aggressive regimes in Japan and Italy and in Germany, particularly, and the Soviet Union. And we have to do this because if they gain leverage globally, the U.S. will not be able to exist as it wants to exist as a liberal democratic country. But the flip side of that coin, if you look at it, particularly if you look at it from an outsider's perspective, it does look like the U.S. And in many cases, it is. It's the U.S. saying the the world needs to be stabilized, but it needs to be stabilized on our terms in a way that benefits us. And that is one part of this too. It's that this is something that if you don't agree with the terms, it does look like the U.S. is reaching not for stabilization, but for dominance.
How would you assess the differences with today and where we are in terms of globalism with the 30s, or maybe another period that you looked at in your book?
One of the things I'm trying to get to with this book, and I'm trying to tell people, is, basic assumptions change. And they can change pretty profoundly, and they often change in long periods of tension and crisis. It's not just one crisis or one overnight thing gets things to alter. And that one of the things, like I was just mentioning with Luce, is while I'm talking about culture and music and things like that, and some of my other comments, is that there really is some serious thinking in political and strategic circles, you might call them, that the U.S. has to be more involved in the world. The chaos of the 30s that eventually becomes World War II is going to affect us. It is affecting us, and we have to take a leading role in securing the globe. And that eventually kind of gets into conservative circles, people like Luce, but also then the Republican Party. Luce and a lot of other people are crucial to the candidacy of Wendell Willkie, who runs against Franklin Roosevelt in 1940 and is this internationalist and globalist Republican, and kind of seen as a kind of a critical moment in how people think about how the U.S. should engage the world. And what you've seen in the last maybe decade or so is it's an interesting reverse that you start to see in conservative circles, where it's during the Cold War, it was, we have to stand up, we have to face down, be it communists or then, and after 9/11 terrorists, we have to use American power to right the world, whether that's in Southeast Asia or in Afghanistan and Iraq. And there's been a rapid drawback from that, particularly on the right. And even before Trump, but Trump has very much ridden that and accentuated that, where now we have to, we should pull back. It should be a much more national policy. We don't need to be, at least, rhetorically, we don't need to be involved in all these places. We want to, end the forever wars. We don't need to be involved in Ukraine. And it's a reversal of the direction the ideas were moving in the 30s and very early 40s.
Do you look also at the economics and let's say that trade aspect, and how has that changed, or how it affects globalism?
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. And I would say that's the core point for many people in this period. And I think, again, it's a reminder for us today. I think one of the things we haven't dealt with as systematically today is how deeply we were affected, and again, globally, by what some people called the Lesser Depression, that came after 2008 and came in waves, let alone then COVID and other things. But that those things leave a mark, and what some people might call just materialism, but the things that affect everybody in their pocketbook and how they live and their opportunity, the opportunities they have in life are deeply, deeply important to understanding, like, how societies and then governments and countries act. And there's a very similar thing happening in the 1930s, which is, there's this wave of economic collapse. And that's the critical thing. Many of the figures I'm working on, see that's the critical moment, is this kind of breakdown of the modern global economy, and that fact, as much as anything else, unleashes, and they use the term, kind of a crisis of security. People suddenly feel insecure around the world and in a lot of places, the United States, but everywhere, but because of economic forces, these big impersonal economic forces. And insecure people throw in their lot with leaders, authoritarians, populists, who come along and say, I alone can solve this problem. The other folks have failed, and I can solve it. And people throw away, right? This is the view of some of these, um, the figures I'm talking about, various internationally minded people. They kind of throw away individual rights and liberties can go by the wayside if you can offer me security for the moment, economic security, kind of stability in the face of all these forces. And that very much is keyed to economic crisis brings social crisis, and then that brings political crisis. And that's what leads to the rise of, new intensified fascist regimes, and growing appeal of communism, and as much as a bunch of other things that are, from the perspective of these folks, less than savory and dangerous. They're dangerous abroad, they're dangerous at home. But they also seem to be a reversal of historical trends. A lot of good stuff came with industrial society. There were problems. A lot of good things came with the Industrial Revolution. But this moment we're in, this Great Depression, seems to have thrown all the gears into reverse. And the gears, too, are kind of grinding up society, leading to all these other problems. I know that was a little wordy, but gets to it.
What have you seen at those various moments of maybe increased isolationism from the U.S.? Were there changes in the economy for the worse, for the better?
The question for a lot of people in the 30s, right, is, how do we contend with this, this global breakdown, which it's very interesting, and it's not unlike the present, that many people, at the moment the Depression starts, many people abroad point their fingers at the United States and they go, the United States caused it. And the U.S. initially is like, no, the Depression started outside. And largely, I think there are a lot of things that cause the Depression, but there's a good argument to say that decisions made in the United States is the biggest, and, the biggest, and at that point, what, if not the most important economy, one of the most important economies, lead to it. And there are some initial responses. I mean, famously, we're talking about tariffs again. It's, again, my point about, we're kind of going into reverse, is that there are a set of tariffs, and famously the Hawley-Smoot tariff, that are about insulating the country, right? We need to protect ourselves. We need to kind of, if we have to put up large tariff walls to protect American industry, particularly American agriculture, from this world that's gone just out of whack, we should do that. And that, of course, is seen now almost universally as a huge mistake. But even after that, and this is forgotten, within the United States, there are a lot of figures who advocate, in industry as well as in politics, for a more isolationist stance, right? And people argue about whether isolation is the right term to use, but they may use terms like America should be self-contained, or America should be self-reliant. Um, it's less it's less about what you call it than what the actual goal is, which is to, yeah, to, and these do, what the fear is that these are going to continue for people who are, advocating a more international or global approach. They see this as, this will continue the immiseration, the U.S. and global prosperity is linked to trade, and we have to maintain that. But it does come to the U.S., and I think people sometimes forget that is actually one of the arguments I'm talking about. I'm recounting and trying to say that there are other things taking root, are nevertheless arguing with some pretty significant and pretty effective counter arguments for different policies and different directions for the country.
Thank you. Have a wonderful afternoon.
Curious by Nature is a production of Newswise. More than 7,000 journalists get the Newswise wires. Visit newswise.com and find out how to spread your news today.